Why Desi Arnaz and Lucy Ball have disappointed millions of people. For millions of Americans in the 1950s, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were the definition of marital bliss. But behind the canned laughter and the iconic "Lucy, I'm home" lay a toxic reality of alcoholism, relentless infidelity, and explosive domestic warfare. A dark secret has finally come to light, revealing that comedy's golden couple was living a nightmare. This isn't a sitcom. It's the tragic, untold story of how the world's most beloved marriage became a knife to the heart. On the morning of May 4th, 1960, the headlines across the United States didn't just report a routine celebrity divorce. They announced the death of an American fantasy. Lucille Ball, the woman who had spent a decade making the world roar with laughter, stood before a judge and testified that her life with Desi Arnaz had become a nightmare. To the public, they were the Ricardos, the relatable, hilarious couple living in a New York apartment. But the cameras never captured the sound of glass shattering against the walls of their real-life bedroom, nor did they record the agonizing silence that followed their most explosive arguments. To understand how comedy's greatest empire crumbled into a heap of resentment and broken promises, we have to look past the grease paint and the costumes. We have to go back to the moment the spark first ignited, long before the world fell in love with Lucy. It was 1940, on the set of a RKO musical called Too Many Girls. Desi was a charismatic Cuban exile, a band leader with a drum and a smile that could melt lead. Lucy was a hard-working, fiery-tempered starlet who had clawed her way up from the chorus line. The attraction was instantaneous and, by all accounts, primal. It was described as a thunderbolt romance, a collision of two high-energy personalities that resulted in an elopement just 6 months later. They were young, beautiful, and desperately in love, but they were also fundamentally mismatched. Desi's life was on the road with his orchestra, a world of nightclubs, adoring female fans, and the temptations of the touring musician lifestyle. Lucy, meanwhile, was tethered to Hollywood, building a career and longing for the stable, traditional home life she had never truly known. By 1944, only 4 years into the marriage, the cracks were already wide enough to swallow them both. The distance between them had fueled Lucy's deepest insecurities and Desi's worst impulses. He was a man who lived for the applause of the crowd, and his womanizing was becoming the worst-kept secret in the industry. Devastated by reports of his infidelities and exhausted by the constant travel, Lucy actually filed for divorce for the first time. The dream was nearly over before it had even begun. However, in a move that would change the course of entertainment history, they reconciled at the last minute. Lucy believed she had found a way to fix her broken man. She had a plan to chain him to her side, using the only thing they both loved as much as each other: the spotlight. Lucy's gambit was simple, yet revolutionary. If she could move from radio to the new medium of television, and if she could convince the network to let her real-life, foreign husband play her on-screen spouse, he would never have to go on the road again. They would be forced to be together every single day. She believed that by creating a fictional version of their marriage, she could heal the real one. The network was hesitant, doubting that audiences would accept a mixed couple. But Lucy was relentless. She bet everything on the idea that professional success would translate into domestic peace. It was a desperate attempt to save a drowning relationship by building a billion-dollar cage around it. They thought they had found the ultimate solution to infidelity and distance. They were about to become the most powerful couple in Hollywood, owners of their own studio and stars of the most successful show in history. But as the I Love Lucy theme music began to play for the first time, neither of them realized that the pressure of their own success would eventually become their undoing. The very show designed to save their marriage was about to become the pressure cooker that destroyed it. Because while the world was watching Lucy and Ricky, the real Lucille and Desi were beginning to realize that you can't act your way out of a tragedy. By 1952, I Love Lucy wasn't just a television show, it was a national religion. Every Monday night, the streets of America went quiet as families gathered around their glowing black and white sets to watch the antics of the redhead and the conga player. On screen, Lucy and Ricky were the perfect domestic unit. He was the hard-working provider with a short fuse, and she was the mischievous but devoted housewife. Their chemistry was undeniable, a crackling energy that felt more real than anything else on the air. And for a brief moment, it seemed Lucy's plan was working. Desi was no longer on the road. He was right there beside her, building a legacy. But as the ratings soared, the walls of their actual home began to echo with a different kind of noise. The laughter of the studio audience couldn't drown out the sound of the arguments that erupted the moment the applause sign went dark. The reality was that the very success Lucy craved was the fuel for Desi's descent. While he was a comedic genius in his own right, Desi Arnaz was also a man of immense pride and a restless spirit. Being confined to a soundstage for 14 hours a day, only to be known as the husband of the world's most famous woman, began to grate on his psyche. He wasn't just an actor, he was the mastermind behind the show's revolutionary three-camera filming technique, yet the public only saw him as the straight man to Lucy's clown. To cope with the suffocating pressure of maintaining a perfect image while managing a multi-million-dollar production, Desi turned to the bottle. Alcohol became his sanctuary and his curse, transforming the charming musician into a man whose temper was as unpredictable as it was explosive. Their daughter, Lucy Arnaz, would later recall the jarring disconnect between her parents' public personas and their private warfare. She described a childhood where the air was often thick with tension, where she and her brother, Desi Jr., became reluctant witnesses to a marriage that was unraveling at the seams. There was no physical abuse, but the emotional volatility was a constant shadow. Lucy, ever the professional, would show up to work with a smile, hitting every mark and nailing every joke, only to go home and face a husband who was increasingly absent even when he was sitting right across from her. She had built a world where they were inseparable, but in doing so, she had created a vacuum where resentment was the only thing that could grow. The tragedy of this period was that the more the world loved them, the more they seemed to lose each other. When Lucy became pregnant with Desi Jr., the show integrated the pregnancy into the storyline, a move that was considered scandalous at the time. When the Lucy Goes to the Hospital episode aired, more people tuned in to see the fictional birth than watched the inauguration of President Eisenhower. They were the most influential couple in the world, the pinnacle of the American dream. Yet behind the scenes, Lucy was haunted by the ghosts of her previous miscarriages and the growing realization that no amount of fame could fix a man who didn't want to be saved. As the 1950s progressed, the I Love Lucy set became a place of high-stakes performance and hidden heartbreak. The writers would craft scripts about Lucy wanting a new hat or trying to get into show business, while in the dressing rooms, the real Lucy was desperately trying to keep her husband sober long enough to finish a scene. They were trapped in a cycle of public adoration and private agony, a paradox that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The world saw a comedy, but the players were living a drama that was quickly approaching its breaking point. By the late 1950s, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were no longer just actors. They were the heads of Desilu Productions, a studio that would eventually produce legendary hits like Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Desi was a visionary businessman, a mogul who had outsmarted the Hollywood establishment to own the rights to his own show. But the higher they climbed, the more the traditional dynamics of their marriage were inverted. In the 1950s, a man was expected to be the undisputed head of the household, yet Desi was living in the shadow of a woman who had become a global icon. This friction created a toxic atmosphere that permeated every aspect of their lives. Desi's womanizing, which had sparked Lucy's first divorce filing years earlier, returned with a vengeance, fueled by his need to assert a masculinity that he felt was being eroded by his wife's superstardom. The transition from the half-hour I Love Lucy to the hour-long Lucy-Desi comedy hour in 1957 was a desperate attempt to lighten their workload and save their sanity. It didn't work. By this point, the marriage was a shell. Friends of the couple noted that they often wouldn't speak to each other unless they were in character. The scripts remained funny, but the atmosphere on set was described by writers like Bob Weisskopf as grim. Lucy's fear that Desi would cheat if he went back on the road had been proven right, but the alternative, keeping him close, had only resulted in him finding ways to stray within the confines of Hollywood. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. Every time Desi's infidelities made the rounds in the industry gossip mills, it threatened the wholesome brand they had spent a decade building. Lucy was a woman who valued control above all else. She was a perfectionist who rehearsed her physical comedy until her body was bruised. Yet she could not control the one thing she wanted most: a faithful husband and a stable home. She felt a profound sense of responsibility to the millions of fans who looked up to them. She once admitted that her darkest moment was the realization that by getting a divorce, she would be disappointing millions of people. This burden of expectation kept them together long after the love had been replaced by tolerance. They were the prisoners of their own success, forced to perform the roles of happy spouses, while the reality was a series of separate bedrooms and cold silences. Desi, for his part, was drowning. The pressure of running a major studio while starring in a hit show, all while battling his own insecurities, led to a total reliance on alcohol. It was no longer just a social habit. It was a necessity. His health began to fail, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. He was a man who had achieved the American dream only to find it was a gilded cage. He loved Lucy. There is little doubt of that. But he didn't know how to be Desi Arnaz while the world only wanted Ricky Ricardo. He was a king in a kingdom where his queen was more beloved, and that imbalance was a wound that never stopped bleeding. As 1960 approached, the facade could no longer hold. The perfect couple was about to face the most public and painful divorce in Hollywood history. They had spent 20 years trying to defy the odds, but the secrets they had kept behind the closed doors of their Beverly Hills mansion were about to come crashing into the light. The final episode they filmed together ended with a kiss, but as soon as the director yelled "cut," they walked off in opposite directions, never to return as a couple. The end wasn't just the wrap of a show. It was the shattering of an American myth. But what many didn't realize was that the end of the marriage wouldn't be the end of their story. In fact, the most shocking chapter was yet to come, involving a second marriage that felt like a knife to the heart for their young children. The divorce of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz on May 4, 1960, was more than just a legal filing. It was a cultural earthquake that left the American public in a state of genuine mourning. For 20 years, they had been the anchor of the American household, the one constant in a rapidly changing world. When Lucy walked into that courtroom, she wasn't just testifying against a husband, she was dismantling a billion-dollar dream. She told the judge that Desi's behavior was unpredictable and that his moods had made it impossible to continue. The woman who had made an entire planet laugh was now a figure of profound sadness, carrying the weight of a failed legacy on her shoulders. She later admitted that her greatest regret wasn't the loss of the money or the fame, but the fact that she had disappointed millions of people. She felt she had broken a promise to every family that had ever looked at her and Desi as the gold standard of love. But while the public felt a sense of loss, the true victims were living inside the house. Lucy Arnaz was only 9 years old, and her brother Desi Jr. was only 7. To the world, their parents were titans. To them, they were just mom and dad, and the home they knew was being torn apart. Lucy would later recount the sheer horror of watching her father pack his bags. For a child, the golden couple tag meant nothing. All they knew was the sound of shouting that finally stopped, replaced by a silence that was even more terrifying. Desi didn't just move out of the house. He moved out of their daily lives, and for Lucy, it felt like a permanent abandonment. She had spent her early years trying to navigate the minefield of her parents' arguments, and now the minefield had simply exploded, leaving nothing but debris. The speed at which the perfect marriage was replaced was perhaps the most jarring part of the tragedy. Within just 1 year of the final decree, Lucille Ball did the unthinkable. She remarried. Her choice was Gary Morton, a stand-up comedian who was almost the polar opposite of Desi Arnaz. While Desi was a fiery, complex, and often troubled genius, Gary was stable, predictable, and, most importantly for Lucy, safe. To Lucy, Gary was a lifeline, a way to reclaim the normalcy she had been chasing since 1940. He didn't drink to excess, he didn't womanize, and he didn't demand the spotlight. He was content to be Mr. Lucille Ball, a role that Desi's ego could never have tolerated. Lucy was desperate for a second chance at happiness, a way to prove that she could have a functional home life. However, for her children, Lucy's quick remarriage felt less like a new beginning and more like a betrayal. Lucy Arnaz famously described the news of her mother's engagement to Gary Morton as a knife in the heart. It hadn't even been a full year since the divorce, and already the space her father occupied was being filled by a stranger. The children weren't ready to move on, even if their mother was. They were still grieving the loss of the only family dynamic they had ever known, and now they were being told to welcome a new father figure into the fold. This period marked the beginning of a complex, decades-long process of healing and resentment, as the children struggled to reconcile their love for their biological father with the man their mother had chosen to replace him. Even as Lucy tried to build a new life with Gary, the ghost of Desi Arnaz never truly left the room. They were still business partners, and more importantly, they were still the parents of 2 children who were caught in the crossfire of their history. The world wanted to believe that Lucy had moved on and found peace, but the reality was far more complicated. She had found a partner who brought her stability, but she had lost the man who brought her fire. And as we look closer at the years that followed, we see that the search for happiness would lead both Lucy and Desi down very different paths, ones that would eventually converge in the most unexpected and heartbreaking way. But as Lucy settled into her new, quieter life with Gary, the world began to wonder. What happened to the man who started it all? Desi Arnaz was about to embark on his own journey of reinvention, but his choice of a second wife would send shockwaves through the family for an entirely different reason. In 1963, 3 years after the divorce that broke a nation's heart, Desi Arnaz found love again. He married Edith Hirsch, a woman who, in many ways, felt like a haunting echo of the past. To those who saw them together, the resemblance was striking. Edith was a beautiful, voluptuous redhead, a showgirl type who looked remarkably like a younger Lucille Ball. It was as if Desi, unable to make it work with the original, had sought out a version of her that he could finally handle. But unlike Lucy, Edith wasn't a superstar. She was, as Lucy Arnaz described her, just a regular dame. She was a woman who knew how to handle Desi's temper, how to navigate his drinking, and how to give him the peace that his high-octane marriage to Lucy had lacked. For the children, Lucy and Desi Jr., Edith Hirsch became an unexpected beacon of light. While they had initially viewed Lucy's new husband, Gary, with suspicion, they embraced Edith with open arms. She became one of Lucy's best friends, a woman who taught her how to drive, took her to the fair, and provided a sense of fun that had been missing from their household during the dark final years of the Lucy-Desi marriage. Edith didn't try to compete with Lucy. In fact, she and Lucy eventually became friendly, even playing cards together. It was a bizarre Hollywood-style domestic arrangement where the ex-wife and the new wife found common ground in their shared experience of loving the same complicated man. The contrast between the 2 new marriages was stark. Lucy's marriage to Gary Morton was built on a foundation of professional support and domestic tranquility. Gary became her producer, her warm-up man, and her constant companion until the day she died in 1989. He made her laugh, and he never embarrassed her in public, a low bar, perhaps, but one that Desi had failed to clear for 20 years. Yet, despite the stability Gary provided, there was always a question lingering in the air. Was there passion? Lucy Arnaz herself admitted she didn't know if her mother and Gary had a passionate marriage, though she hoped they did. Gary was the medicine Lucy needed to survive the trauma of her first marriage, but Desi was the drug she could never quite quit. Desi's life with Edith was different. In the quiet of their home, Desi taught Edith how to cook, and they settled into a life far removed from the pressures of Desilu Productions. But the shadow of alcoholism and the health problems caused by years of hard living continued to follow him. Even with a supportive wife, the damage was done. Desi had walked away from the empire he helped build, selling his shares of Desilu to Lucy and effectively retiring from the spotlight. He was a man who had conquered the world, and then decided he didn't want it. He spent his final decades in a state of semi-seclusion, a legend who had become a ghost of his former self, while Lucy continued to dominate the television landscape with new shows and new successes. The tragedy of the Lucy and Desi saga is that they both found exactly what they were looking for in their second marriages, yet they never stopped looking back at each other. Gary Morton was a tremendous supporter of Desi, often praising him to studio audiences, and Desi, while he would make jokes about Gary, considered him a friend. It was a civil, almost healthy resolution to a toxic beginning. But beneath the surface of this newfound peace lay a profound sense of what if. They had proven they could be friends, they could be parents, and they could even be successful apart. But the dark secret of their marriage remained. They were two people who were perfect for each other on camera, but destined to destroy each other in the dark. As the years turned into decades, the health of the four protagonists began to fail, leading to a series of final goodbyes that would prove, once and for all, where their true loyalties lay. Because when the end finally came for Desi and Edith, the first person to call wasn't a business associate or a fan. It was the woman who had started it all. The 1970s and early 80s brought a strange, beautiful twilight to the story of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. The fire and brimstone of their divorce had long since cooled, replaced by a deep, weathered respect that few could have predicted during their darkest days. It is one of Hollywood's most unique ironies that the golden couple only truly found peace with one another once they were no longer bound by the laws of marriage. They had reached a plateau of friendship that was both seasoned and sincere. They were no longer the Ricardos, and they were no longer the warring Arnazis. They were simply two people who had built an empire together and shared the DNA of two children they both adored. This period saw the four adults, Lucy, Desi, Gary, and Edith, forming a domestic quartet that defied every tabloid expectation. Gary Morton, often dismissed by the public as a mere footnote in Lucy's life, proved to be the glue that held this delicate piece together. He was a man of remarkable security, never feeling threatened by the towering shadow of his predecessor. In fact, Gary became one of Desi's greatest advocates. During his warm-up routines for Lucy's later shows, he would frequently speak to the audience about Desi's genius, ensuring that the man who built the house always got the credit he deserved. Desi, in turn, would rib Gary with jokes, but the affection was real. They were two men who loved the same woman in very different ways, and they found a way to do so without the poison of jealousy. It was a master class in maturity that allowed Lucy and Desi Jr. to finally have the stable family unit they had been denied in their youth. But as the 1980s progressed, the laughter began to fade into a more somber reality. The years of heavy smoking and hard drinking were finally catching up with Desi. He was no longer the vibrant band leader who could conga all night. He was a man facing the inevitable decline of his health. And he wasn't alone in his struggle. Edith, the woman who had brought joy back into his life, was also facing her own battle with cancer. The regular dame who had been the best thing to ever happen to Desi was slipping away, and the empire they had all built was suddenly overshadowed by the frailty of the human body. The strength of their unconventional bond was tested as never before during these years. When Edith passed away in 1985 at the age of 67, the first person Desi called wasn't a doctor or a priest, it was Lucy. She was there for him in his grief, just as she had been there during his triumphs. They were two survivors of a different era, leaning on each other as the world they knew began to disappear. But even as they mourned Edith, the clock was ticking for Desi himself. The man who had given America its most iconic husband was preparing for his final curtain call. On November 30th, 1986, what would have been their 46th wedding anniversary, Lucy called Desi one last time. He was barely conscious, drifting in and out of the world. But when he heard her voice, the spark returned. They spoke for a few moments, two old souls revisiting a lifetime of memories in a few brief sentences. As the call came to an end, Lucy whispered, "I love you," a phrase she had said thousands of times on camera, but never with this much weight. Desi's final words to her were a perfect reflection of their entire journey. "I love you too, honey. Good luck with your show." 2 days later, on December 2nd, Desi Arnaz passed away at the age of 69, leaving a void in the heart of the woman who had been his greatest partner and his greatest rival. The impact of Desi's death on Lucy was profound. Though she remained married to Gary Morton and continued to live her life in the public eye, a part of her seemed to go dark when Desi died. Lucille Ball followed Desi just 3 years later, passing away in 1989 at the age of 77. Her death marked the official end of the "I Love Lucy" era, but the revelations about their marriage were only just beginning. As Lucy and Desi Jr. grew older, they began to speak more openly about the dark secrets that had plagued their parents' lives: the alcoholism, the infidelity, and the crushing pressure of fame. They wanted the world to understand that their parents weren't just caricatures of happiness. They were complex, flawed humans who had suffered immensely to bring joy to others. The disappointment Lucy felt about the divorce was a burden she carried to her grave, never fully realizing that the public loved her more for her humanity than for her perfection. The story of Lucy and Desi is a reminder that the most beautiful things are often the most fragile. They built a world of laughter on a foundation of tears, and they maintained a friendship on a battlefield of broken promises. They taught us that you can divorce a spouse, but you can never truly divorce a soulmate. Their legacy isn't just a sitcom that plays in reruns across the globe. It's the story of two people who were big enough to forgive the very things that destroyed them. Looking back through the lens of history, the dark secret of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz wasn't just the alcoholism or the infidelity. It was the crushing, impossible weight of the pedestal they were forced to live on. They were the architects of the modern celebrity era, the first couple to have their private lives commodified and sold back to the public as a product. Every time Desi stumbled or Lucy wept, they weren't just failing each other, they were failing a global brand. This realization created a unique kind of psychological prison. In her later years, Lucy's reflection on her darkest moment being the disappointment of millions reveals the tragic priority of the era. The image was more important than the individual. They spent 2 decades pretending that a sitcom script could fix a broken heart, and when the illusion finally shattered, they were left to pick up the pieces in the harshest light imaginable. Their daughter, Lucy Arnaz, eventually became the curator of this complicated legacy, peeling back the layers of the perfect Ricardo family to reveal the scarred human Arnaz family underneath. She spoke of the hard stuff, the arguments that echoed through the hallways when the cameras stopped, and the horrible nature of a divorce that was played out in the court of public opinion. Yet, in doing so, she gave her parents a second life, one characterized by truth rather than tropes. We now know that Desi's drinking wasn't just a vice. It was a response to the pressures of running a studio and being the lesser half of a power couple in a patriarchal society. We know that Lucy's drive for perfection wasn't just a professional trait. It was a desperate attempt to create a stability she never felt at home. The most poignant revelation from the family's later years is the concept of successful failure. Their marriage failed by traditional standards. It ended in a courtroom and was followed by quick remarriages. But their relationship succeeded in a way few ever do. They transitioned from lovers to enemies, and finally, to the most trusted of friends. They proved that the end of a contract is not the end of a connection. Desi's last words, "Good luck with your show," were the ultimate blessing. It was a man who had once been threatened by his wife's success, finally acknowledging that her light was meant to shine, with or without him. They died separately, but they lived on as a singular unit in the mind of the world, a testament to a bond that was forged in the fire of Hollywood's golden age. Today, we view I Love Lucy with a bittersweet nostalgia. We laugh at the chocolate factory and the grape stomping, but we now hear the echoes of the silence that followed those scenes. The tragedy of Lucy and Desi is that they had to lose their marriage to find their peace. They had to disappoint the world to save themselves. As we analyze the ruins of their empire, we see that the most valuable thing they ever built wasn't a studio or a sitcom. It was the grace they showed each other at the very end. They were two flawed people who loved each other too much to stay together, and just enough to never let go. But as the final credits roll on this Hollywood epic, what remains of the people who survived the storm? And what is the ultimate lesson left behind by comedy's most haunted couple? The story of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz ended long ago in the physical sense, yet it remains one of the most studied and discussed chapters in entertainment history. Desi passed in 1986, followed by Edith in 1985. Lucy joined them in 1989, and Gary Morton lived until 1999. Today, their children Lucy and Desi Jr. are the last living links to that era, continuing to protect the memory of parents who were both larger than life and deeply human. The empire of Desilu is gone, sold and absorbed into larger conglomerates, but the impact of what those two people created in a small Hollywood studio continues to shape every television show we watch today. They gave us the template for the modern sitcom, but they also gave us a cautionary tale about the price of the American dream. The message they leave behind is a profound one. Perfection is a performance, but love is a practice. For 20 years, they performed perfection for us, and it nearly destroyed them. For the 30 years that followed, they practiced love through forgiveness, friendship, and mutual respect, and that is what ultimately saved them. They proved that a horrible divorce doesn't have to be the final word on a life shared. In the end, Lucy and Desi weren't a disappointment to millions. They were a gift to millions. A reminder that even the most broken stories can find a beautiful, quiet resolution if you are brave enough to let the cameras stop rolling. If you found this deep dive into the real lives of Lucy and Desi enlightening, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from Hollywood's vault. We want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Lucy and Desi were truly soulmates, or were they just two people caught in a beautiful, tragic storm? Does knowing the dark secrets change the way you watch the show today? Let's keep the conversation going below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history. Next chapter of history. Next chapter of history. Next chapter of history. Next chapter.